The grave had been dug open from the inside, not the outside, and the body was gone. But that wasn't what made my hands shake. The soul lantern beside it was empty. No smoke, no ash, no trace of dark magic. Just an empty flame socket where a person's soul should have been burning. This was the 7th village in a month. 7 graves, 7 missing souls, and not one drop of blood at any of the scenes. Something was harvesting the dead before they could even rest, and it was getting bolder every time. I knelt in the mud and found a single set of footprints leading away from the grave, small, bare, and pointed east toward the old ruins where the sealed gate to the hollow realm had supposedly stood untouched for 200 years. The High Council summoned me 2 days later. I am a soul warden, one of maybe 6 left alive who can track a soul's signature after it's been stolen. They told me the trail led to one place. The gate into the hollow realm, sealed since the last holy war, was leaking again. Cardinal Ashgrave briefed me personally, which should have warned me something was wrong. He said the mission was simple. Cross the gate, locate the stolen souls, retrieve what I could, and return before the barrier closed again in 7 days. He didn't explain why he insisted I go alone. Brother Talon argued to come with me. Ashgrave refused him outright, citing protocol, and told him to wait at the gate instead. Talon didn't like it, and neither did I, but orders were orders, and I had spent my whole life trusting that the church knew more than I did. Before I left, Ashgrave pressed a sealed medallion into my palm and told me not to trust anything in that realm that spoke to me kindly. I remember thinking it was strange advice from a man who'd never set foot past the gate himself. He called the medallion a ward against demonic influence. I didn't learn until much later that it was actually a tracking rune, designed to report my location back to his office the moment I crossed the threshold, whether I wanted it to or not. The hollow realm didn't look like the stories. No fire, no screaming pits, just a sky the color of a bruise and silence so complete I could hear my own pulse. I walked for an hour before anything answered back. The medallion Ashgrave gave me grew warm against my chest the deeper I walked, pulsing faintly like a second heartbeat that wasn't mine. I told myself it was reacting to demonic presence nearby. I didn't yet know it was reporting my exact position home. A voice came out of the dark, soft, almost bored, and it said my name. Not my title, not priest, not intruder. It said Ezran, the name only my mother used before she died. A name no record in any church archive had ever written down. I turned with my blade half drawn and found nothing behind me. Whatever had spoken was already gone, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, like something was deciding whether I was worth speaking to again. 3 shadow hounds found me an hour later, and I nearly lost an arm before they simply stopped moving, all 3 collapsing at once like puppets with their strings cut. I hadn't touched them. Someone else had. She stepped out from between 2 black trees like she'd been standing there the whole fight, watching. Pale, sharp-eyed, dressed in a gown the color of dried blood, with horns curling back from her temples like a crown that grew out of her skull instead of sitting on it. "You've gotten taller," she said, like we were old friends catching up. Not a demon and a priest meeting for the first time. I told her we had never met. She smiled like I'd told a joke only she understood. She introduced herself as Queen Vaelith, ruler of the Hollow Realm, and said she already knew why I'd come. Before I could ask how, she turned and started walking, telling me to keep up if I wanted my answers before the gate closed. I followed because I had no better lead, and because some instinct I couldn't name told me she wasn't lying about knowing more than she should. That instinct terrified me more than the hounds had. She led me to a chamber lined with glass jars, each one glowing faintly, each one tagged with a name. One jar matched a missing villager from the 4th grave I'd investigated. She said she'd been collecting evidence for me, gathering proof before I even arrived. I asked her why a demon queen would help a church priest recover stolen souls. She said she wasn't helping the church. She was helping me, and made it clear those were 2 very different things in her mind. She reached for my hand without asking and traced a scar across my knuckles, then told me exactly how I'd gotten it. Falling off the chapel roof at age 7. Reaching for a bird's nest, breaking my fall on the gutter. Nobody alive knew that story. I'd never told anyone. I pulled my hand back and demanded to know how she knew that. She only said, "You'll remember eventually," and offered me a room in her palace for the night, insisting the gate wouldn't let me pass again until morning anyway. I tried to catch her in a lie to prove she was simply guessing well, inventing a false memory on the spot about a scar on my shoulder that didn't exist. She looked at my shoulder, frowned, and said plainly, "That one isn't real. You're testing me." She was right. I refused the hospitality on principle, told her I intended to finish my mission and leave as fast as possible, no favors owed. She didn't argue. She just said, "You always say that first," and walked away before I could ask what she meant by always. She won a game of stones against me that first evening without seeming to try, and afterward asked plain, ordinary questions about my life, my favorite foods, what made me laugh, nothing sinister in any of it. For an hour she just felt like a person, not a threat, and that unsettled me more than the hounds had. That night in the palace's guest wing, unable to sleep, I heard humming through the wall. It was my mother's lullaby, note for note, a song she never wrote down, never taught anyone but me, and had been dead for 11 years. I was in Vaelith's chambers within a minute, blade in hand, demanding an explanation. She didn't flinch at the weapon. She said, calm as anything, "You taught me that song, in a life you don't remember living." I told her that was impossible, that reincarnation wasn't real, that this was some trick to unsettle me before she tried something worse. She let me rage and didn't argue a single point, just watched me with an expression that looked, uncomfortably, like patience. I wrote it down anyway when I got back to my room. Clue 1. She knows the lullaby. I told myself I was documenting a threat, not believing a story. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, breakfast was already waiting when I woke, and it was spiced pear stew, the exact dish my mother used to make on my birthday. I hadn't mentioned it to a single soul in this realm. I didn't touch the food. I started searching the palace at night instead of sleeping, moving room to room while the halls were empty, looking for anything that would explain what she knew and why. Most doors opened easily. One wing didn't. 2 armored demon knights stood guard outside a sealed corridor, expressions blank, spears crossed. When I asked what was inside, they said only that it was the Queen's private archive, and that no one entered without her permission. I pressed a servant girl for information the next day, gentle questions over spilled ink and a borrowed rag. She told me, voice low, that the sealed wing held Her Majesty's memories, and that it had been locked longer than the girl herself had been alive. Her name was Yold, and she'd grown up in the palace kitchens after her family died in a border skirmish years before. She said the Queen had never once raised a hand against her, only against people who threatened what the Queen called the promise. I asked what promise. She didn't know. I pressed a scrap of wax against the lock that night while the knights changed shifts, hoping to copy the key's shape later. I nearly finished before a voice behind me asked what I was doing, and I turned to find Vaelith standing there, alone, no guards. "I felt you near," she said, which was somehow worse than if she'd caught me outright. She didn't call for punishment. She only said, "Curiosity has gotten men killed in this palace before. Be careful whose doors you knock on." It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a warning meant kindly, which frightened me more. 3 days later, Talon crossed the gate against orders, worried I hadn't sent word. He found me in the palace courtyard and immediately noticed something I hadn't said out loud yet. He said the Queen never stopped watching me, even when she was speaking to someone else entirely. I told him everything. The lullaby, the scar, the sealed wing, the stew. He went pale and said we needed to leave immediately, that whatever this was, it wasn't hospitality. I agreed, but the gate wouldn't open for either of us that night. His travel papers had gone missing. We agreed on a signal between us after that, a specific knock pattern on any shared wall if either of us needed help fast. Felt childish setting it up. Felt necessary using it 3 days later. Vaelith claimed ignorance about the papers, but her expression when Talon's name came up had already told me the truth. Something in her sharpened whenever he was near, subtle but unmistakable, like a blade being quietly unsheathed under a table. Talon started having nightmares that same week, waking pale and shaking, unable to describe what he'd seen. He said it felt like something had been in the room with him, watching, deciding whether he was worth the trouble of removing. That night, 3 assassins in unmarked armor breached the guest wing and nearly killed us both before Vaelith arrived and ended the fight in under a minute, without a scratch on her. I should have been grateful. Instead, I noticed she'd known their route before they took it. I asked her outright how she'd arrived so fast, positioned so perfectly. She said only, "I protect what's mine," and left before I could ask what exactly she considered mine. Talon heard it too, and his face told me he liked it even less than I did. That was the knock on the wall Talon and I had planned for. I used it that same night, and he was in my room within seconds, weapon drawn, before either of us admitted the real danger wasn't the assassins anymore. Sister Marin arrived 4 days later through an emergency church portal, sent to assist the investigation after my reports stopped making sense to anyone back home. I'd known her since seminary, trusted her more than most, and was relieved to have someone objective in the room. Vaelith greeted Marin with perfect courtesy and a smile that didn't move past her mouth. The temperature in the room, figuratively, dropped several degrees the moment Marin took a seat beside me at the study table, and stayed there for the rest of the evening. Marin had brought research of her own. Old church texts reference something called a recursive priest, a soul that returns to the same location and the same choices across multiple lifetimes, over and over regardless of memory. She thought it might explain the missing souls. I thought it might explain me. We worked late into the night comparing notes, and more than once I felt eyes on us from the shadows near the door, though every time I looked, nothing was there. I didn't mention it to Marin. I wasn't ready to say her name out loud as the reason. I deliberately let my hand rest near Marin's on the table once, just to see what would happen. A small test of my own aimed at the shadows rather than at her. Nothing happened that night. I noted it anyway, and kept watching. By morning, half of Marin's research pages were missing from her satchel, torn out clean at the spine. She was furious, certain someone in the palace had gone through her things overnight. I already suspected who. I just didn't want to be right again. Marin found scorch marks along the missing page's edges when she checked the satchel closer. A signature burn that matched no palace guard's magic she'd ever catalogued. It matched only one person in the entire realm. I confronted Vaelith directly, no diplomacy left in me. She didn't deny it outright, which was its own kind of answer. She said only, "She doesn't need to know everything. Not yet. Not before you do." It wasn't a denial. It was a decision she'd made for me without asking. 2 days later, Marin nearly died in the East Corridor when a curse meant to look like a stray palace ward detonated inches from her, burning through half her sleeve before Talon pulled her clear. Too precise to be accidental. Too personal to be random. I found Vaelith in the throne room and demanded to know if she'd done it. She didn't answer with words. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I won't lose you to forgetting." Not to her. Not to anyone. It was the first time she'd said it plainly. I told her that wasn't protection, it was a threat wearing protection's clothes. She didn't argue the point. She simply turned the conversation elsewhere, as if my anger were a weather pattern she intended to wait out rather than address. I lay awake most of that night thinking through everything I'd learned so far, and made a decision I hadn't expected to make. I would stop trusting the church's version of this mission completely, and start trusting only what I could verify myself piece by piece. The next morning, 2 guards were posted outside my door, polite, apologetic, and immovable. When I tried the servants' corridor instead, I found it blocked as well, the staff there offering the same soft apology. I realized slowly that I was no longer a guest. Being confined wore on me faster than I expected. I paced the same 3 rooms until I knew every crack in the floor, and caught myself talking to the walls just to hear something other than silence and the guards' polite refusals. I tested the boundaries for 2 more days, mapping every exit, every guard rotation, every excuse they gave for keeping me inside. By the 3rd day I had a plan, and a wax impression of the sealed wing's lock finally cast into a working key. I slipped past the night guards using the servant girl's earlier directions and let myself into the sealed corridor for the first time, heart hammering loud enough I was certain it would give me away before the lock even turned. Inside was a hall-lined floor to ceiling with glass vials, each one holding a thread of soft, glowing light, each one labeled with a date. Some dates were centuries apart. All of them, somehow, felt like they belonged to the same person. Further in stood statues and portraits of a man across different eras, different armor, different robes, different faces even, but the eyes were always the same. I recognized them because I saw those eyes in the mirror every single morning. A chained journal sat on a pedestal at the hall's center, its cover worn soft from handling. I broke the clasp without hesitation and began to read, my hands shaking harder with every page. The entries spanned lifetimes. A knight named Corvin, a wandering scholar, a monk who never spoke his birth name. Each entry described meeting the same man, loving him and losing him always the same way, always to something that wiped him clean of ever having known her. One line stopped me cold. He always comes back to me, even when they try to erase it. I only make certain he doesn't wander somewhere else while he waits to remember. I understood, reading it, exactly what that curse on Marin's sleeve had really been. Footsteps echoed at the hall's entrance, and I barely had time to duck behind a shelf before Vaelith walked in alone, cradling a freshly sealed vial in both hands like something newborn. She hadn't stopped collecting. She was still doing it, even now, even with me under her roof. She set the vial gently among the others and spoke to the shelf as if it could hear her. "Just a little longer," she said, "and you'll remember everything. This time I won't let them take you again." Her voice cracked on the last word in a way that unsettled me more than any threat had. I left before she could sense me, shaking the whole walk back, and spent the rest of the night writing everything down for Marin. Not as evidence against a demon anymore. As evidence of something I was starting, against every instinct, to believe might be true. The next day I confronted Vaelith with what I'd found, no longer hiding that I'd broken into her sealed hall. She wasn't angry. If anything, she looked almost relieved, like she'd been waiting years for me to finally be brave enough to ask. She explained it plainly, no more riddles. A soul retains fragments of itself across reincarnation, and she had spent centuries gathering the pieces of mine that the church kept trying to erase. Every vial was a memory. Every portrait was proof she'd never once let go. I asked her why the church would erase a priest's memories at all. She said the war between the realms had lasted as long as it had because of one particular bloodline. Mine. Because every time that bloodline remembered her, it chose peace and chose her, and the church couldn't allow that outcome. I told her flatly I didn't believe the church would do something so monstrous just to keep a war alive. She didn't press the point. She only told me to check the church's own restricted archive myself, through someone I trusted, before deciding she was lying. I asked Marin to dig quietly through church correspondence using her clearance, careful not to raise suspicion with Ashgrave's office. It took her 2 days to find a sealed file labeled with a name that meant nothing to me and everything to Vaelith. The Right of the Unremembered. The file listed names spanning 6 generations, each one a priest of my exact bloodline, each one recorded as having completed service in the Hollow Realm before vanishing quietly from church records afterward. My own name was already listed, dated for a report that hadn't been written yet. Tucked behind that file was a second one, an expense ledger for something called ritual fuel, and it finally explained the missing villagers that had started this whole mission. Ashgrave's own agents, disguised as raiders, had been harvesting souls from border towns for years, feeding them into the Right of the Unremembered to keep it powerful enough to erase a priest's memory clean every single generation. I sat with that file for a long time, unable to speak. Everything Vaelith had told me, everything I'd refused to believe, was sitting in black ink in my own church's restricted archive, filed away like routine paperwork. Talon hesitated over the signal stone for a full day before using it, turning it over in his hands during meals, during watch shifts, clearly wrestling with something he hadn't told me yet. Talon, still convinced Vaelith was the greater danger no matter what the file said, secretly activated a signal stone he'd carried since arriving, alerting Ashgrave's office to everything happening inside the realm. He believed sincerely that he was protecting me. What none of us knew yet was that Ashgrave had been counting on exactly this outcome from the moment he sent me through the gate alone. The mission was never about retrieving souls. It was about confirming I was the priest the file was waiting for. Ashgrave's strike team crossed the boundary 2 days later, disguised as reinforcements sent to extract me safely. Talon met them first, and something in their formation, too precise, too armed, made his stomach turn with the first real guilt he'd felt since sending that signal. Church envoys requested a private audience with me, no one else present, not even Marin. I agreed out of habit and years of trained obedience, and immediately regretted it the moment the doors closed behind them. The lead envoy was a gaunt man named Brother Corin, handpicked by Ashgrave himself, and I recognized the same cold efficiency in him that I'd always associated with the Cardinal's inner circle. Men who followed orders without ever asking what they served. They told me the mission was complete, the souls already recovered by another team, and that I was to return home immediately. No explanation for the discrepancy. No room for questions. Just an order and an escort waiting to enforce it. I refused, demanding proof the souls had actually been retrieved, certain now that something was very wrong. The lead envoy's expression shifted, and binding sigils flared to life around my wrists before I could reach for a weapon. Vaelith broke through the chamber wall before the sigils could close fully, and what followed wasn't a rescue so much as an execution. The envoy and his escort were gone in seconds, and I stood there staring at the wreckage of my own church's ambush team. I was horrified by the violence, but underneath that horror sat something colder and more honest. She had just stopped my own church from taking me by force, and there was no version of that morning where I walked away from it unchanged. Vaelith sealed every gate leading out of the Hollow Realm that same hour, putting the entire kingdom on war footing against further church incursion. I found out only after it was already done. No consultation, no warning, just a locked border and a queen daring anyone to cross it. I confronted her about the lockdown, furious she'd made that choice for me without asking. She said, flat and unflinching, "If I open them, they take you. I've buried too many versions of you to let that happen again." It wasn't cruelty in her voice. It was exhaustion. I demanded she at least let Marin leave safely, whatever she decided about me. She agreed, reluctantly, and I could see how much that single concession cost her. Like she was handing away a piece of armor she'd worn her entire life. That night, Talon vanished from his room without a trace, and my first thought, immediate and cold, was that Vaelith had finally decided he was a threat worth removing permanently. I searched the palace for hours before I found him. He was alive, chained in a lower cell, exhausted but unharmed, having been caught mid-transmission trying to contact Ashgrave again after everything that had already happened. Vaelith had found him first, and dealt with it quietly, without telling me any of it. I confronted her immediately, no patience left. She admitted it without hesitation. He was going to get you killed. I removed the threat. I told her that wasn't her decision to make, that she didn't get to choose who counted as dangerous to me and act on it alone. She didn't back down. "I would rather you hate me and live," she said, "than love someone else and disappear." I told her that sounded exactly like something the church would say to justify its own crimes, and for the first time that comparison actually landed. I demanded Talon's release outright. For the first time since I'd arrived, she refused me flatly, no compromise offered. It was the clearest boundary of her control I'd hit yet, and it told me plainly how far she was and wasn't willing to bend. I decided I couldn't wait on her permission anymore. I found the servant girl who'd helped me before and asked for her help again, offering what little I had left to trade, mostly trust she'd earned honestly over the past weeks. Together we slipped past a distracted night shift and freed Talon from his cell before dawn, moving fast and quiet through corridors I now knew almost as well as the guards did. Talon broke down the moment we were clear, confessing everything, the signal stone, the report to Ashgrave, all of it. He said he'd only wanted to protect me. I told him I understood, but that protecting people by lying to them had apparently become everyone's favorite excuse lately. We agreed we needed proof strong enough to stop this cleanly. Not more violence, not more secrets. Marin, still in the realm awaiting safe passage, pulled one more thread from her research and found a smuggled ledger fragment, years old, proving the erasures across 6 full generations, methodically, deliberately. Buried in the ledger was a reference to a shrine within the Hollow Realm's border, built to mirror a sealed sanctum inside the church's own cathedral. The two locations, we realized, were ritually linked, which meant whatever happened at one could theoretically be witnessed at the other. Marin cross-referenced one more region's records that same week and found a second bloodline, unrelated to mine, that had suffered the same erasure decades earlier before simply dying out. Mine was the only line still alive to prove it had ever happened at all. I decided that was the answer. Not fighting Vaelith, not fully submitting to her either, but performing a counterrite at that shrine, in front of witnesses from both sides, and forcing the church to watch its own crime unfold in real time. I told Vaelith the plan directly, expecting resistance. Instead, she studied me carefully, suspicious it might be another attempt to leave her for good, dressed up as strategy. I told her the truth. It was the only way any of us walked away from this without more blood. She insisted on coming with me to the shrine herself, unwilling to risk losing me mid-ritual to another erasure while she waited somewhere else. I agreed on one condition. Whatever happened, Talon and Marin would be allowed to leave the realm freely, no matter the outcome. She agreed to that condition, reluctant but sincere, and something in the way she said it felt different from every promise she'd made before. Smaller, quieter, and somehow more honest for it. We spent the next 2 days gathering the memory shards from the Hall of Echoes needed to power the counterrite, sorting centuries of glowing vials into an order that made sense only to her. Even Vaelith's own guards, gathering the vials under her direction, handled each one with a care that surprised me, and I realized then that her obsession wasn't a secret kept from her court. Every soldier in that palace already knew exactly what she'd spent centuries protecting. I noticed halfway through that 2 of the oldest vials never made it into the collection pile. When I asked, she claimed an oversight. I didn't believe her, and I said so, watching her expression carefully for the lie underneath the calm. That night I caught her hiding one of the missing vials in her own chambers, tucked behind a mirror where she thought I wouldn't look. I demanded to know why. She finally admitted, voice unsteady, "That life ended badly. I don't want you to see how it happened. Not yet." I told her the ritual needed everything, no exceptions, no matter how painful the memory was for either of us. She hesitated a long time before finally surrendering the vial into my hands, watching my face like she expected it to change everything between us. The memory showed a life where I had married someone else. A stranger's face I somehow recognized as mine to love once, and Vaelith's past self, in her grief, had razed an entire village to the ground. It was the worst thing I'd seen her do, and she'd shown it to me herself. I sat with that image a long time, sick and shaken, but underneath the horror I also saw something else. Real remorse, not performed for my benefit, sitting behind her eyes like a wound that had never properly closed. "I've done terrible things trying to keep you," she said quietly. "I won't pretend otherwise anymore." It wasn't forgiveness I felt hearing it. It was something closer to understanding, which scared me almost as much as the memory itself had. Meanwhile, back across the border, Ashgrave learned his first strike had failed through a surviving spy planted among his own envoys, and immediately began assembling a second, larger force aimed directly at the shrine we were preparing to use. Before we left, Vaelith met with her war council for nearly an hour, positioning her generals along the border in case Ashgrave's second wave came from a different direction entirely. It was the first time I saw her rule like a queen protecting a kingdom, not just a woman protecting one man. We set out for the shrine with Talon and Marin as our witnesses and guards, traveling through parts of the realm I hadn't seen before, watching demons bow to Vaelith not out of fear alone but something closer to genuine respect. The shrine itself matched the cathedral's forbidden inner sanctum almost stone for stone, confirming everything the ledger had claimed. Whoever built this realm-side mirror had done it deliberately decades ago, expecting exactly this moment to eventually arrive. I began the counterrite at dusk, and it required me to relive every stolen memory in order, out loud, projected live through the shrine's link into the cathedral's sanctum for anyone gathered there to witness firsthand. The first memory surfaced gently, childhood scenes with my mother, her lullaby playing exactly as Vaelith had sung it. Proof laid bare that every claim she'd made from our very first meeting had been true the entire time. The second memory hit harder. A past life as a knight named Corvin, who fell in love with a young demon noblewoman and chose, deliberately, to defect from the church's war for her sake. Memory intact, decision made freely. The third memory was the cruelest. Church priests dragging Corvin back by force, restraining him, and performing the very first rite of the unremembered on him while he screamed for them to stop. His memory of her erased in real time before my own eyes. The link carried all of it directly into the cathedral, visible to every elder gathered there. Undeniable now in a way sealed files and careful denials had never been. I could feel, even from the shrine, the shock wave of silence that must have followed. Ashgrave, watching his own crime broadcast to the very council he answered to, ordered his second strike team to breach the shrine immediately, ritual or no ritual, determined to stop it before the truth could finish spreading. Knights broke through the shrine's outer wards mid-ceremony, and chaos erupted around the binding circle. I was still trapped inside, unable to defend myself while the ritual demanded my full concentration to complete. Talon planted himself directly in front of my vulnerable body, fighting to hold the line, while Marin worked frantically to reinforce the shrine's circle against the sudden disruption tearing through its edges. I managed to force one hand free from the ritual's grip long enough to scratch a warding sigil into the stone beside me, something I'd memorized years ago and never used, buying Marin a few extra seconds to finish her half of the binding. Vaelith moved through the strike team with a precision I hadn't seen from her before, protecting the ritual itself rather than simply destroying everything in reach, controlled in a way her earlier violence never had been. Ashgrave crossed through a churchside portal himself, entering the shrine physically, intent on severing my soul link personally before the ritual could finish, even if killing me was the only way left to stop it. I was helpless mid-ritual, unable to move, unable to defend myself, watching him close the distance with a blade meant to end everything permanently. Vaelith reached him first. She took the strike meant for me directly, the blade catching her across the shoulder instead, and for the first time since I'd met her, I watched her bleed defending me instead of controlling me. I nearly broke concentration seeing her fall, ritual be damned, but Marin's voice cut through the panic, telling me to finish it, that completing the rite was the only thing that could still save all of us, Vaelith included. I forced myself through the final memory. The truth, laid bare across every lifetime shown, that I had chosen Vaelith freely each and every time, never coerced, never manipulated into it. The church hadn't just erased memory. It had erased my consent itself over and over. The ritual completed in a rush of light, flooding the cathedral's sanctum with proof no elder present could pretend not to have seen. Centuries of a crime committed by their own institution, laid bare in front of witnesses who could no longer look away. Ashgrave, cornered by his own broadcasted history and a wounded queen still standing between us, tried to justify it anyway, claiming the erasures had been necessary to prevent a priest-empowered uprising through my bloodline's connection to the throne. I rejected that justification out loud, in front of everyone still watching through the link, accusing him plainly of manufacturing a war for generations just to preserve his church's grip on power. The elders present, watching everything unfold live, voted on the spot to strip Ashgrave of his title, the political ground shifting under him faster than he could argue his way back onto solid footing. A senior elder named Mother Wren, who had opposed Ashgrave quietly for years without proof, stepped forward on the link and formally accepted temporary command of the church, promising a full account of every erased name within the season. Desperate, with nothing left to lose, Ashgrave lunged at me directly, blade raised, reasoning that killing me now would at least end whatever legacy the truth had already destroyed for him. Talon stepped into the strike without hesitation, taking the wound meant for me and collapsing hard, but breathing, his earlier betrayal finally answered by an act that cost him everything he had left to give. Vaelith, wounded but far from finished, closed the distance and ended Ashgrave decisively, no hesitation. No mercy left for a man who had spent generations erasing lives for the sake of a war that never needed to exist. Silence fell across the ruined shrine as the fighting stopped, the link to the cathedral finally closing, leaving only wreckage, blood, and the four of us still standing among it. Search teams later found the remaining harvested soul fragments still sealed in Ashgrave's private ritual chamber, every one of them intact. Mother Wren personally oversaw their return to the villages they'd been stolen from, giving each family the burial the church had denied them for a full year. I went straight to Talon and Marin, checking wounds, stabilizing what I could, prioritizing them over anything else in that moment, even the queen bleeding quietly a few feet away, watching me tend to the others first. The full weight of everything restored settled into me slowly. Hundreds of years of choosing her, and hundreds of years of losing that choice to men who decided my memory wasn't mine to keep. I looked at Vaelith and found I had no idea what to say to her yet. Days passed while everyone recovered inside the realm, and the church, chastened and exposed, finally sent formal envoys instead of soldiers, opening real negotiations for the first time in longer than either side could accurately remember. I spent that recovery time walking the Hall of Echoes with Vaelith, finally seeing our shared history laid out complete, without secrecy standing between any of it anymore, every vial now something we examined together instead of something she hid. Vaelith, afraid of this fragile piece and afraid I might now be free to leave without any reason left to stay, proposed something she called the Undying Vow, an ancient binding rite meant to fuse our souls permanently. She explained it plainly. No future church, no future ritual, no future death could ever erase our memory of each other again. It would end centuries of loss in a single ceremony, immediate and total. I was tempted, hearing it. Every version of pain we'd survived could simply stop, right there, permanently solved. But I asked what it actually cost, and her hesitation told me the answer before her words did. She admitted the vow also removed my ability to ever choose otherwise. Once bound, neither of us could walk away again, by design, forever, no matter what either of us wanted afterward. She told me, quietly, about the life I'd seen in the hidden vial, the one where I'd married someone else. She said she'd watched from a distance for 40 years that time, unwilling to interfere, and had still lost me completely the day I died without ever remembering her name. I realized, sitting with that admission, that this was her oldest fear turned into a spell. Losing me again, solved permanently by removing my choice from the equation entirely, the same crime the church had committed, just wearing a different name. I told her I understood exactly why she wanted it, but that I wouldn't do it. Every past version of me had chosen her freely, without coercion, and that act of choosing was the part actually worth protecting, not erasing for convenience. She reacted badly, old instincts flaring hard beneath the surface, accusing me of not loving her enough to guarantee forever if I wouldn't take the one certain path available to secure it. I held my ground. I've chosen you every life without a spell forcing it, I said. That has to be enough, or none of it was ever real to begin with. The words landed harder than I expected, on both of us. For a moment it seemed like centuries of old patterns might repeat right there. Her hand closing around the ritual dagger meant for the vow, torn visibly between fear and what I'd just told her. I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else in that room, aware that a single wrong word from either of us could tip the moment past the point of no return. Marin and Talon, still recovering nearby, watched in tense silence, unsure whether to step in or let the moment play out on its own terms without interference from either of them. I didn't run and I didn't fight her for it. I simply stood still and waited, meeting her eyes, refusing to make the choice for her the way everyone else in her life apparently always had. She lowered the dagger slowly, and for the first time in the entire story, she wept, openly admitting she was terrified of an eternity spent losing me piece by piece, memory by stolen memory, over and over without end. I offered her an alternative instead of the vow. A written record, kept together, documenting every life, hidden somewhere safe that no church ritual could ever reach or unwrite. If my memory was ever taken again, I told her, the record itself would become a map back to her, something honest to find and read and choose again from, freely every single time without forcing anything. She wasn't sure it was enough, having relied on control and magic for so long that the idea of simply trusting evidence felt foreign to her, almost frightening in its own quiet way. I pointed out that the Hall of Echoes had already proven the method worked. It was how I'd found the truth this time, through evidence laid bare, not through compulsion or a spell binding me into place. She agreed to try it on the condition the record stayed within the hollow realm under her care, a small compromise that still let her keep something close, rather than a full surrender of every instinct she'd built her whole existence around. That night we began the first shared entry together, both of us contributing details from our own separately remembered histories, checking each other's account against the others for the first time without hiding anything. We argued over small details more than once, whose memory of a given year was more accurate, and settled it the way anyone might, by comparing notes until the truth sat somewhere in the middle. It felt almost ordinary, which after everything, felt like a kind of miracle. Mother Wren sent a church envoy to the border every season after that, not to inspect or interfere, but simply to confirm the treaty was holding. A small ritual of accountability neither side wanted to let quietly lapse the way old promises usually did. The peace negotiations formalized within weeks. The church publicly disbanded the Rite of the Unremembered and issued a formal acknowledgement of every erased priest lineage across the 6 recorded generations, my own bloodline finally named without shame. Talon chose to stay near the border afterward, working as a liaison between the 2 realms, partly making amends, partly having come to genuinely respect the restraint Vaelith had shown when it mattered most. Yold, the servant girl who'd helped me twice, was given her own position overseeing the newly reorganized archive, a job Vaelith offered her personally as thanks, and one Yold accepted with the first real pride I'd seen on her since we'd met. Marin returned to the church to help rebuild its record, keeping honestly from the ground up, staying in contact with me through letters that arrived steadily, closing an old door gently and without any lingering bitterness between us. I chose to remain in the Hollow Realm, not because any gate was sealed against me, but because I decided to, and I made a point of saying it aloud, plainly, in front of Vaelith and everyone else present. She heard me say it and reacted with quiet disbelief, and used to being chosen without some mechanism forcing the outcome, like the sentence itself didn't fully compute against everything she'd learned to expect from centuries of loss. Old habits didn't vanish overnight. She staged one final test not long after, a fabricated rival scenario meant to see whether I'd still choose her under manufactured pressure, an echo of the manipulation she'd relied on before. I caught the test immediately, sharper now than I'd been at the start of all this, and called her out on it directly instead of playing along the way I might once have. She admitted it, visibly embarrassed, and offered a real apology, the first genuine one of its kind, proof of actual change rather than another performance staged for my benefit. I told her plainly that the testing had to stop completely if any of this was going to work between us going forward, and she agreed, this time without needing to be pushed into it. Months passed, and the written record grew steadily, now filled with ordinary days instead of only centuries of grief and war, small entries about nothing important at all, which somehow mattered more than anything that came before. I took on a new role recognized formally by both the church and the realm, a bridge priest meant to prevent a crime like Ashgrave's from ever happening to anyone else again. She held a public gathering in the throne hall announcing the open borders herself, standing in front of her full court, and for the first time introduced me not as a prisoner or a project, but simply as the man she'd chosen in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. Vaelith, in turn, opened the Hollow Realm's borders wider than any ruler before her had ever dared, using her power now for genuine stability instead of possessive control over one single person. Her old fear still resurfaced sometimes, small moments of checking the record obsessively, needing quiet reassurance, but she caught herself now instead of acting on it the way she once would have without a second thought. I never pretended she was fully healed, and I didn't need to. I simply kept choosing to stay through the imperfect moments too, concretely, one ordinary day at a time, proof stacked on proof instead of promises. We sat together in the Hall of Echoes one quiet evening, the shelves relabeled now, reorganized as a shared archive instead of a shrine built around obsession, history kept rather than hoarded. She asked me, half joking and half serious, what would happen if some future life of mine never reached the record in time, never remembered any of this at all before it was too late. I told her honestly that if that happened, she'd have to let that version of me choose for himself without forcing anything, and trust that the pattern held because it was real, not because it was bound by force. She didn't love the uncertainty in that answer, but she accepted it, calling it the least comfortable kind of trust she'd ever had to survive, said with a small, tired laugh that felt more honest than anything she'd said before. I told her that was probably the healthiest sentence she'd spoken since the day I met her, and for once she didn't argue the point, just leaned into the moment and let it be simple. The final entry we wrote together that season wasn't about war or memory or gods at all. It was mundane, domestic, a record of one ordinary evening, written deliberately to prove the ledger wasn't only for tragedy anymore. I added my own private note in the margin afterward, unseen by her at first, a promise that this time, with no spell forcing either of us, I intended to stay for good. She found the note by accident weeks later, and for once didn't confront me about it or turn it into another test. She simply kept it, quietly, tucked against the page where she thought I wouldn't notice. The church sent formal word not long after, confirming the treaty was permanent, the war truly over, and no future priest of my bloodline would ever be subject to the old rite again. A young acolyte training under Mother Wren asked Talon once, at the border post, whether the old stories about a priest and a demon queen were really true. Talon just laughed and told her to ask me herself sometime, if she ever earned the clearance to cross the gate. Talon visited from his border post around the same time, telling me, with a grin I hadn't seen from him in months, that I finally looked like a man who'd stopped running from something. Marin's letter arrived that same week too, congratulating us both, closing an old door gently one more time, without bitterness, the way only real friendship manages to do. She wrote one more line at the very bottom of the page, almost an afterthought, saying that whatever the ledger recorded going forward, she hoped at least one entry would simply say we were happy. I read that line twice before folding it away. Standing on the shrine grounds where everything had nearly ended, I told Vaelith plainly that I wasn't choosing her because of the past lives, the record, or the war's end. I was choosing her for this one, right now, on its own terms. She didn't need proof, a spell, or a written record to believe me this time. She simply believed it, standing there in the quiet, no test left to run, no fear left loud enough to argue with what I just said. Yold locked the doors behind us at Vaelith's request, and for the first time since I'd arrived in that realm, no guard was posted outside them at all. We closed the doors of the Hall of Echoes together that afternoon, leaving the shelves behind as history instead of a cage, and walked out into the realm as it actually was now, not as either of us had once been afraid it would always stay. Somewhere back in that hall, a new page in the record sits blank, waiting for whichever life comes next. But in this one, right now, I choose her, and for the first time in centuries, she lets me choose it on my own.